If you've been following these videos for a while, you probably heard me mention my grandfather a few times. My grandfather, that's basically the reason why I've always said, growing up, I kind of knew what Narnia was, had a general sense of, what Narnia was, even though I hadn't actually read them. I think I may have had them read to me as a kid at some point, have some memories of that. But whenever I would go to my grandfather's house, there was always Narnia books and C.S. Lewis books and all that stuff lying around because my grandfather actually taught a course on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and some other things called the Oxford Mythmakers. My grandfather was a English professor at the University of Florida for quite a while. And that was kind of my first exposure to Narnia. That's the reason I kind of grew up knowing what it was. He wrote some books on C.S. Lewis. One of them is this one right here, The Bright Shadow of Reality, Spiritual Longing in C.S. Lewis. And he's certainly quite a, it's pretty safe to call him a C.S. Lewis expert. He knows what he's talking about. I've had some really fun conversations with him about that, of course. He actually wrote to C.S. Lewis on two occasions and received handwritten responses. So that was pretty cool. But several months ago, I decided to sit down with him. I was over at the house and just asked him some basic questions about C.S. Lewis and his experience and knowledge and everything. So that'd be a nice thing to get on video. And since there's not much news right now, I don't think I'm going to do that video on talking about the apted commentary and the deleted scenes. There's just, I don't know, not much there I'm really interested in talking about at this point. I'm kind of ready to move on from the Shredder, the movie, finally, into some other things maybe. But so that'll be fun to share this video. So here's just a few minutes with the guy that kind of indirectly got me into Narnia in the first place. Here's my grandfather. Hope you enjoy it.
I first read Perelandra when I was a junior at Wheaton. I had influenza and I was in the infirmary and I read the novel Perelandra by C.S. Lewis. That was my introduction. I was interested and then I read I think The Great Divorce and probably some more of the fiction. I don't quite remember the sequence. Well, of the Narnia books, I like The Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
My favorite as well.
Yeah. Of the total Lewis corpus, I guess I like Mere Christianity because it's such a good introduction to the faith. And I'm very fond of That Hideous Strength, which is the third book in the Space trilogy. I really got into Lewis through George MacDonald when I was doing my master's at Columbia in 1953 after I graduated from Wheaton, who was such an important influence on Lewis. And my thesis was called George MacDonald and the Higher Faith, meaning his view of the atonement and some other things which were rather controversial. He, was a Congregationalist minister, but at one point he was not welcome in Scotland, and he made a living by writing all these novels because he had a huge family, and to support them he wrote books, and in that day you could get royalties for your books, and he made money by writing novels. A lot of them were what they were called novels of Scottish kail-yard life. In other words, schoolyard life, things like that. They were homespun, ordinary stories. Nothing fantastical. But he did write two fantastic stories that appealed to Lewis. One was called Fantasties, or Fantasies, and the other was called Lilith. And Lewis was very impressed by both those books. And he says that reading Lilith, arrested his attention as a young man and brought him really toward Christianity as much as anything. Tolkien was a good friend of Lewis, and in fact, the trilogy would never have been published if it hadn't been for Lewis's nagging.
Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Right, right. Tolkien was a perfectionist, would not let things go, had to work and rework them. And Lewis said, if you don't go ahead and publish that, it's never going to be seen. And so finally, Tolkien submitted it, and it was published.
It was a good idea, I guess.
Well, of course, it was more popular than some of Lewis's books. I wrote 2 letters to Lewis, and I got replies both times. One was about losing my faith in reason. I had been reading Freud and Kierkegaard and Sartre, and they all seemed to say that reason was not to be trusted. So I wrote to Lewis, and he said, if you are losing your faith in reason, why did you use all those reasons to tell me so? Which was a very good reply. And then the other letter I wrote to him was later. I asked him about the nature of myth and his precise definition of myth in Miracles. He had a footnote in Miracles that dealt with myth, and I wanted to see what he meant by that. His writing was not easy to read, but, it was decipherable. Very thoughtful, very clearly reasoned out. He didn't answer anything flippantly. He taught me early on that you could be an intelligent person, an intellectual, and be a Christian, because he was such a good example of that. Mm-hmm. I think, in our day, many people think you can't get those 2 things together, and I was pleased at his mastery of so many intellectual issues and his ability to write for the ordinary reader. Not only the fiction, which will be of, enduring appeal, but I think the things for people wanting to learn theology, his writings for, like, Mere Christianity. I think that's going to be continuing interest.
All right.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis, master, my grandfather.
Is that the closing?
I guess that's the closing.
All right, very nice.
For now.
I appreciate that.